If you grew up during the 90s, then there's at least two things I can say about you with some certainty. Firstly, you're most likely an annoying shit with an entitlement complex, the kind of person who likes to flood Tumblr with Power Rangers and Nick at Night gifs. Secondly, you probably played Pokémon at some point, even if it was just ironically.
Yes, in the late 90s you couldn't swing a cat without hitting one of these googly-eyed anime shits, and the cat was probably a fucking Pokémon too. The Pokémon brand was, and to a certain degree still is, a transmedia behemoth, with cartoons, comic books, a bunch of movies, and a fuck ton of toys, but it all began with these two fairly simple Game Boy games.
And they weren't even that good. Except that they were, and I'm lying about just how much I loved them to make myself seem cool and aloof, but the fact is that everyone was playing the game back then. Everyone. And if you weren't playing the Game Boy game, you were playing with these.
The Game Boy game centred around two things, collecting monsters and making them fight, which makes Pokémon the perfect game to adapt as a competitive Magic the Gathering style trading card game. I was never big on the game myself, but as best as I understand it from watching my friends play back at school, the game centres entirely around acquiring a shiny Charizard card, and then going around telling everybody that you've got a shiny Charizard card, at which point it becomes a race to see who can beat that kid up and steal the shiny Charizard card before someone else gets there first.
This was a violent time for many, a sort of 1990s Hunger Games if you will. But the card game was immeasurably successful, unless you're measuring in money, in which case it was a lot. And as is the case with many successful things, inevitably someone's going to want to turn it into a video game, even if the successful thing is itself an adaptation of a pre-existing game.
Yes, it was a weird choice, not a far cry from the sort of logic that led to the creation of Street Fighter the movie The Game, but it's to our benefit, because Pokémon Trading Card Game for the Game Boy Color is actually sort of good. Taking the basic formula of the video game on which the card game is based and building out in a more video gamey sort of way, you play as a young collector of Pokémon trading cards who travels around the world participating in Pokémon trading card game battles, along the way facing off against 8 club masters with the goal of earning medals and, true to the schoolyard version of the game, stealing their shiny cards.
The mugging aspect of the game has been stripped out in favour of the lesser known but more family friendly playing the card game the way it was actually meant to be played. It's actually a fairly faithful recreation of the game and features cards from the first 3 sets of the trading card game, as well as a handful of exclusive cards.
The rules of the card game have translated rather well to its digital counterpart, although 2 of the physical game cards have been changed as they couldn't get the cards to work as intended on the Game Boy Color.
But apart from that, it's very faithful, which, while fun, actually works to the game's detriment, because after a while it starts to feel a bit redundant.
The screen layout for the trading card game is not that much different from the layout of the actual Pokémon games, so you find yourself sitting there playing a video game adaptation of a card game based on a video game originally released for the system you're playing the card game video game on right now, and sort of enjoying yourself, but wondering if it's time that might perhaps be better spent playing the actual proper game.
Don't get me wrong, the presentation is fantastic, and a compelling argument could be made for this game being the best realised spin-off of the Pokémon franchise, but it's all a little bit redundant and incestuous. It's a little bit like being Marty McFly's mother in that scene in Back to the Future where she kisses him in the car. You go into things all eager and excited and possibly a little bit drunk, and then you lock eyes. In this case, you catch your own reflection in the Game Boy Color screen, and you realise that what you're doing somehow feels wrong. Yes, that's what this game is like. It's like kissing someone who feels like they're your brother, but is in actual fact your son from the future.
It's very well done, it's fun and engaging, and the soundtrack features some of my favourite music ever to appear on the Game Boy, and it is a good game, don't get me wrong, but all the time there's that nagging feeling at the back of your head telling you that the whole experience is a waste of time.
The whole why not do it for real argument against video games has always really pissed me off, especially considering how much I love Rock Band, so it's internally frustrating for me to have to sit here and say, yeah, I could be playing a proper Pokémon game instead of this. And there is a rich history of card games and board games that have adapted to video games really well. I lost track of the amount of time that I spent playing Hero Quest and Space Crusade on the Amiga as a kid. But the nature of this game, and indeed the very platform you're playing it on, render the entire experience more or less moot. But I'd still really like a sequel, please.